Hello history fans and welcome back to the channel that helps you learn a little bit of history. Today's video is the random history facts from last time, but I'm going to be whispering them in the reverse order. So you might not have heard them because you'll have been asleep by the time I said them in the last video. So don't forget to like and subscribe before you fall asleep, and let's just get going. Catherine of Aragon was a Spanish princess. She first married Arthur, the heir apparent to the English throne, but he sadly died, so she remarried the next in line, that would be Henry VIII. She became the first female European ambassador in history in 1507, becoming the ambassador for the Aragonite crown of England. She served as regent for 6 months while Henry was in France, overseeing English victory in Scotland, and also at that time she had a stillborn child. She would have multiple stillborn children and miscarriages, and actually did give Henry his first son, but he sadly died at just 52 days old. Her only surviving child would become Bloody Mary, or Queen Mary I. Henry's next wife, Anne Boleyn, served as one of Catherine's ladies in waiting from 1526. And Henry had actually already had her sister Mary as a mistress. She refused to be a mistress though, Anne refused to be a mistress, and was made Marquistess of Pembroke before she would marry him. And she also suffered many miscarriages, and her only child would be Queen Elizabeth I. She was executed for adultery, incest, and treason, along with the 5 men she supposedly had affairs with, one of which was her brother. Not. His next wife, Jane Seymour, gave him the son he wanted, and had served as lady-in-waiting to Anne, who she also shared a great-grandmother with, as did Catherine Howard. She was supposedly very good at peacemaking in court, being gentle compared to the previous women, and she made Henry reconcile with his first daughter Mary, who would then act as chief mourner at her funeral. She was the only one given a queen's funeral and is buried with Henry. Anne of Cleves marries Henry a while after Jane died, but only lasted 6 months. Henry blamed her appearance, but they actually did remain friends, so one could argue that she got the best deal out of things because she just accepted the annulment, which pleased Henry, so then he made her an honorary member of his family as the king's beloved sister. She was given Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, and she outlived all his wives and is the only one buried in Westminster Abbey. Catherine Howard had a pretty turbulent and nasty life. She went to serve as Anne's lady-in-waiting because her uncle saw the opportunity, and Henry noticed that. A year into their marriage, she was alleged to be having affairs, and later the Archbishop of Canterbury would investigate it, and she would be executed for treason. And then Catherine Parr, she outlived Henry by only a year. She's the most married English queen, being married 3 times. She's the first Queen of England and Ireland. She's the first queen to write and publish a book under her own name in 1545 called Prayers and Meditations. Then I did 10 facts about Mary Antoinette. She was one of 15 children, but she would only have 4 children and 1 that survived to adulthood. She gave birth in view of the public because the king decreed it, and said that all queens or princesses should, to ensure the legitimacy of the child, and that no imposter baby could be snuck in. After she had her children, her hair lost its oomph, so her hairdresser gave her wigs. She had them 4 feet high, covered in white flour, and even started wearing ornaments in her hair, like when the French won a naval battle, she had a model ship in her wig. She played the flute, the harp, and the harpsichord, and met Mozart when he performed for her family in 1762. She loved drinking chocolate so much that she had a chocolatier brought from Vienna to Versailles. Apparently, her husband, the king, quite liked her, actually, and gave her privileges that his other queens hadn't got, like allowing her to choose the shows and the entertainment put on at court. She got married to him at age 14 in 1770, after travelling to France, where she had to give up her pet dog, but I think they were eventually reunited. While at Versailles, she had a mock village built where she and her friends could wander around an artificial lake, farm, and have parties away from court. She didn't say let them eat cake when the French peasants didn't have bread to eat. And after she was executed and dumped in an unmarked grave, Madame Two Swords sculpted her face in wax. Medieval Britain facts. Eels were used as currency. Someone once rented land for 26,000 eels. A beauty ideal in medieval times was a big forehead, so women would pluck their hairlines and eyebrows. So like eyebrows down, hairlines back. Animals could be put on trial if it was thought they had broken a law. Edward III made it law that every Sunday all able men would take part in archery practice, giving us the best archers in the world. So medieval England had victories in battle because of archers. They had gong farmers or nightmen who collected the human waste from moats and sold them on to farmers for fertiliser. Golf was created in Scotland and was so popular that in 1457 James II prohibited golf and football because they were too much of a distraction from practicing your archery. Football was banned a few times in medieval England, like in 1314, because Edward II said it was too noisy and might cause evils. A punishment for a criminal could be to wear an animal mask or a badge that displayed their crimes. Piggy banks in medieval times were a type of clay pottery called pig, P-Y-G-G, that people would store coins in, but the phrase piggy bank doesn't come about until the 1700s. It meant a jar where coins were kept. Queen Victoria came to the throne at 18 years old in 1837. She ruled until 1901, which is a long time, so there's a lot of change. The empire grew, science advanced, as did the Industrial Revolution and the arts, and there's a lot of social and political reform too. Daily life saw a huge disparity in that there's huge social inequality. I feel like you probably know how the wealthy lived. The middle class was expanding, and there was a demand, because there was a demand for goods or services that they could then organise but then cheaply source the labour for. The largest group of workers were domestic servants, because now men in the middle classes needed servants. Almost 1/3 of women between 15 and 20 worked in the service. As you'd expect, that was one of the nicer jobs for the lower class. Just to stay out of poverty, the rest worked in mines or factories to avoid the workhouses of the destitute and unemployed. Later in Victorian times, there were reforms limiting the hours that women and children were allowed or expected to work. There was cheaper food imports and new terraced houses that were connected to clean water. The Roman Empire started in 27 BCE, after the fall of the Republic, and it lasted until the 5th century in the West, when they lost Britain, but it carried on for a lot longer in the east of the empire. Octavian was the first emperor of Rome, becoming Emperor Augustus in 27 BCE until the year 14. Then we have his dynasty of Julio-Claudian emperors, which are my favourites, or the one I know the most about, with Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius and Nero, and they're then followed by the Flavians. Some of the favourites or best rulers of the Roman emperors came from Aurelius and Marcus Aurelius, because at that point in time the rule wasn't just passed down hereditarily, so they were quite good rulers, not just the son. It's called the Golden Age of Rome. There's a lot of expansion and consolidation of power. Some creepy random facts. The Battle of Waterloo was looted for the teeth of dead soldiers because they were sold to dentists to make dentures. King Tutankhamun's parents were probably siblings, which explains why he was so frail, but that's not an unusual relationship for ancient Egypt. In 1494, Italian sailors coming home from the New World brought back a lot of syphilis from the French army, and they spread the Great Pox throughout Europe. You could get ulcers on your skin, and your skin would rot away, and people's noses just dissolved from their face. In the 1800s, tuberculosis, called consumption then, was draining people and making them pale. So it was assumed you were being drained by a vampire if you had it. And one family in Connecticut in America were all dying of consumption, so a vampire hunt began, and because it was believed one of the family members had to be feeding off of the rest, so they exhumed the bodies of the mother and two daughters, and then the most recent one to die was called Mercy Brown, and her body was in a better condition with some decaying blood still around her heart. So she was the vampire, and she was the one whose heart and liver were burnt at the stake. I feel like this is going to be a short video because my camera's already dying. Sorry, gang. I feel like you prefer the normal speaking one to the whispered anyway, so. 10 Tudor facts. They had 6 monarchs: Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Jane Grey, Mary I, Elizabeth I. They used moss or leaves as toilet paper, and the king had grooms of the stall who wiped his bum, and who was trusted political advisor. They founded the Church of England, drastically changing English history, all because Henry VIII wanted a new wife. Oh, I'm not on face tracker, hang on. Henry VIII's first wife was originally married to his brother, Arthur. They played board games like chess or backgammon, or tennis. They loved sugar. Sometimes they ate rose petals covered in sugar, and Elizabeth I ate so much that she had black rotten teeth, and that meant it actually became fashionable because it could show you could afford to eat sugar. Shakespeare invented lots of words. Tudors believed in magic, so they carried around amulets for protection and good luck. And apparently Henry VIII was a talented musician. In ancient Egypt, facts, probably the most famous pharaoh, Cleopatra VII, was actually Greek. She descended from Ptolemy I, who was one of Alexander the Great's generals, and the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for 300 years. Women, or the Egyptians, would use Dead Sea salt to exfoliate. They worshipped cats amongst 2,000 other gods. Most pharaohs were overweight. They had terrible diets of 3 banquets a day. Some of the earliest medical texts written about the dangers of obesity come from 15,000 BCE. But apparently they were concerned with overeating, so they would take a laxative 3 times a month. They had lots of different board games. Women could divorce and remarry. I had a video about Guy Fawkes, so context. When the Tudor period had a lot of drama, but a big one was that Henry VIII split England from the Catholic Church and created a new version of Christianity. Protestantism was the new Church of England, all because he wanted a divorce. So she names King James VI of Scotland to become James I of England. He was also a Protestant, so would continue the peace that Elizabeth had created. And when he became king in 1603, Catholics had had enough of hiding. Robert Catesby, Guido Fawkes, and 4 other men were those wanting to act. They were joined by 7 others at the Duck and Drake Inn in London, and decided they would blow up the Houses of Parliament on the state opening day, when the king and all his lords and commons were there, on the 5th of November 1605. The night before, they put a load of gunpowder below the Houses of Parliament, and Guy Fawkes was going to be the one to blow it up. He would light the match that lit the fuse. So then he was down in the basement, and he was the first one caught, and that's why he's who we remember, but he wasn't the sole leader. He was caught in the early hours of the morning, because a few days beforehand an anonymous letter had been sent to Lord Monteagle, telling him not to attend the state opening, and it's thought he was a relation of one of the plotters. It's not thought, he was, through marriage I think. Some random ones. The Erfurt latrine disaster in 1184 was a meeting of nobles gathered in the ancient church at Erfurt, including the German King Henry VI. The floor beneath them gave way, and they fell into the cesspit below, and a lot of them drowned in excrement, with others being injured in the fall. Godfrey the Hunchback, or the Duke of Lower Lorraine, was assassinated in 1076 after he was using the toilet and someone used a sword or a sharp weapon. Because the medieval buildings' toilets were just sort of open, overhanging the side, so anyone from underneath could just get him. But it took him a few days to die from internal bleeding. Toilets in Roman times were communal, so you'd sit next to your friends. And castles, or luxury ones, built in Norman times, they were called garter robes, and they were indoor toilets that went into a cesspit below. The Celts were a group, or the name of a group of different tribes of people in Europe, from maybe as early as 12,000 BCE. They had similar cultures and traditions, which is why they're all put together as Celts rather than different tribes. They're first documented in the 8th century, when the Roman Empire ruled most of the places they were. So they wrote about barbarians, or Galli, meaning the first time we have something written about them, as the Celts comes from the Romans, because the Celts were an oral society. They didn't write things down. Witchcraft goes all the way back to ancient times, or rather accusing people of it. People believed to be practicing magic have always been persecuted. In the earliest times, witches were said to be using magic to call upon spirits to change things or help things, but most were pagans working for the devil. In reality though, they were wise women or natural healers who were misunderstood and villainized. Apparently the earliest reference to a witch is in the Bible in the book of Samuel, from maybe as early as 931 BCE, when King Saul uses a witch to summon the dead prophet's spirit. Witch hysteria came about in the 1400s, with torture and witch hunts becoming common practice by the 1500s. And there was a book, Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486, and then The Hammer of Witches, which was a guide on how to identify and interrogate them. And then the famous Salem witch trials in the 1600s took witch hysteria from Europe to the New World. The saying old codger comes from medieval times. On a hunt, the king would bring birds to hunt, and they were carried in a wooden frame called a codge. The old, trustworthy servant would be the man to carry them, and they were called codgers, and being old codgers. In desperate times of summer or poor harvest, people resorted to eating old rye, or rather making bread with old rye, which could be infected and then cause hallucinations. We only had forks from the 1500s. Before that it was just spoons and knives. suggested way to fight off pneumonia was to cover yourself in newspaper to keep you warm at night. Arsenic, a poison, was in soap, wallpaper, food and clothes. The Victorians were obsessed with ancient Egypt and would hold parties to unwrap mummies. Despite wearing black for years after her husband's death, Victoria didn't like black at funerals, and hers was white and purple. Toothpaste was made from charcoal and honey, and apparently it was poor taste to visit people before 3 p.m, and the closer friends you were, the later you could visit. It's actually illegal to be drunk in a pub in England because the Licensing Act of 1872 says you can only be drunk on your own property. The longest diplomatic alliance in history is between England and Portugal, signed first in 1373. French was our language for 300 years after William the Conqueror became king, and it lasted until 1362, but it was only really the nobles that spoke it anyway, so it wasn't really our language. Since 1826, there has been an annual cheese rolling contest in Gloucester. In the 1660s, Christopher Merritt added fizz to wine, inventing sparkling wine in the Cotswolds, 30 years before the French monk Dom Perignon invented it in Champagne. In 1814, there was the London beer flood, when a wooden vat of a lot of beer burst open at a brewery. It sent beer all over the streets of London, and it flooded the streets of St Giles Rookery, which is where there's a dense area of housing, typically a slum. And so being a slum, it was largely populated, and it actually killed 8 people. Ancient Greece, they invented the yo-yo in about 500 BCE. They didn't eat beans because they thought they contained the souls of the dead. The marathon came from ancient Greece when Pheidippides ran 26 miles from Marathon to... It's auto-corrected to atheist, I'm gonna say Athens, to announce a battle victory. They would add water to their wine so they didn't become too drunk and barbarous. They invented theatre. Stones or broken ceramics were used as toilet roll. They invented cheesecake. Hair was a symbol of your manhood and intelligence. And unibrows were fashionable for women. Spiders are called arachnids because the Greek goddess Athena. Basically, there was a woman who said she was a better weaver than Athena. So they had a competition and she wasn't. And as punishment, Athena turned her into a spider and said that the rest of her lineage would forever be weavers. And her name was Arachne. So that's why spiders are arachnids. The year 25 through time. 325 BCE, Alexander the Great's army fought the Malayans. 225 BCE, Augustus or Octavian became Roman consul for the 9th time, and Rome was the largest city in the world. In the year 25, the Han Dynasty was restored in China. 125, Hadrian built the Pantheon. 425, there was a short Roman civil war between the West Roman Emperor and the East Roman Emperor. 525, Dionysius Exiguus, a monk, created the BC AD system, believing that that was the first year of the birth of the year of the birth of Jesus. 825, there was a battle between the kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia that Wessex won, becoming the dominant power in Europe. 1025, Poland was crowned its first king. In 1225, King Henry III issued a new version of Magna Carta after John, who signed the original, died. In 1325, Edward II's wife Isabella left for France and remained there with her new lover Roger Mortimer, before returning the next year to make Edward III his son, the king. 1825, Charles I became king, and in 1925, Mussolini declared himself dictator in Italy. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, and Earl Wise invented the potato chip, and Charles Jenkins the first television set. In ancient Egypt, there was a disease caused by a parasitic worm that made men bleed out of their penis, not bum. It was so common that people thought it was just part of growing up. The Romans used urine to wash their clothes and their teeth, which worked well because of the ammonia, but they didn't know that. In 1859, London was in a crisis because, yes, they had started using great plumbing, but it just went into the River Thames, and then those who didn't have plumbing would just throw their waste into the closest water anyway. So the Thames became so thick it could barely move, and then there was a hot summer, so then it became known as the Great Stink, because London stank so much. The first female doctor known by name in history is Meriptar, from around 2700 BCE. Her name is in hieroglyphs in a tomb that described her as the chief physician. In the 1800s, some aristocracy took up making their own shoes for fun. In 1929, in Sussex County Magazine, a story called The Dragon of Knuckerhole was published, part of folklore for a while, before it then became one of the many British culture's dragon tales. It's said that there's a huge dragon living in a pool near Lyminster. It would eat the cows and the women. And Jim Puttock decided he was going to deal with it. So he took the dragon a huge suet pudding. The dragon ate it all, including Jim's horse and cart, and then demanded more. So Jim brings him an even bigger pudding, to which the story says the dragon gets the collywobbles, which is so good. So the dragon's ill, and then pretending to offer him medicine, Jim gets close and actually gets him in the head with an axe and kills him. According to late Anglo-Saxon chronicles, vampires were rife in England. In one village, it said that two peasants who had died were seen wandering around with their coffins on their back, knocking on people's doors, and whoever's name they called would soon get very ill and die. So they opened up their graves. They found corpses not really decayed, and cloths over their faces covered in blood. So naturally, they cut off their heads, put them between their legs, and cut out their hearts and burned them, which was the sensible way to be rid of a vampire. It's said that two blackbirds flew up from the fire, and the vampires were never seen again, and the poorly people recovered. That story was recorded in the 1190s. Sorry, can you hear my rings rattling? By William of Newburgh, and he said that seeing the Wailing Dead was so common it was kind of boring to write about. There's also zombie tales as well. In 1819, men had grown bored of riding horses, and they began riding the dandy horse, which is like a hobby horse or a little horse on wheels. And the Prince Regent supposedly had four, although at this point, perhaps not because he was young and cool, but actually because he was so overweight he needed help moving. In the 1800s, the rich held mummy unwrapping parties where guests would watch the process of unwrapping a mummy and take home souvenirs. In the 19th century, menstruation was thought to cause hysteria and madness. Medical texts written by leading medical professionals said that periods made women mad and violent. We say incoherent things, we roar, we scream, we shriek, we moan. According to Dr. William Rowley in his text Passio Hysterica, menstruation was dangerous because it caused this hysteria, and it had something superstitious, and it was all linked with the moon It was John Burns in his The Principles of Midwifery in 1811 who wrote that menstruation was to be considered a disease, not only a disease but a danger. Basically, there's always been an ignorance of men in the medical profession trying to control women's bodies and make us out to be insane, when we're not. 536 was the worst year in history. There was a volcanic eruption in Iceland that spread ash so badly it blocked out the sun for over a year, for 18 months. Europe, the Middle East and some of Asia were just in constant darkness. The next 10 years were pretty rough too, with more eruptions and then the coldest decade ever, and the first plague pandemic that helped with the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire. But there are other years, like the Black Death, 1347. 1816 was a year without summer, similar to 536. There was a volcano erupting, and it was one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions ever in recorded human history. Ancient Egyptians would kill a mouse and put it in their mouth if they had toothache. Victorian cities had bone grubbers, where they would take rotting bones from butchers, rubbish and stockyards and sell them on to dealers, who would then sell them on to be made into various things like toothbrushes or teething rings or soap. A cook of Henry VIII was boiled to death because he accidentally poisoned soup. Or was the tester just allergic? In the Roman times, you might dye your hair with a mixture of leeches and vinegar that was pickled for 40 days, but then would possibly poison you. Shards of broken pottery were used by poor Romans as loo roll. In the 17th century, to make thicker violin strings, sheep's innards were intertwined so that the string makers, they then had to be really careful not to rupture the tissue of a sheep when they killed them. Richard the Lionheart captured Cyprus and then made the men shave their beards. Poems in the 1700s reference the fact that women would trap mice and then skin them and glue their fur to their faces to replace their eyebrows. In the 1780s, the chainsaw was invented to cut through the pelvic bone more efficiently, to save dying mothers from very long procedures or labour where bones were previously cut with a tiny knife. Stone Age people are said to have killed bears, ripped open their stomach and then eaten the meat that the bear had just eaten. In the 18th century, it was common to cut the gums of your baby to stop teething because they thought it was safer than letting the teeth break through naturally. And the earliest archaeological evidence for skincare comes from ancient Egypt 6,000 years ago, where they used castor and moringa oil to stop wrinkles, clay to cleanse their skin, and Dead Sea salt to exfoliate. And my camera is flashing at me that it's gonna die, so we'll leave it there. I hope you've enjoyed. Let me know if you prefer these whispered versions or just the normal quiet talking random history. But for now I'll keep doing both because why not? Thank you very much for watching. I hope you sleep well. Please do subscribe and I'll see you next time.